Hello and welcome to this long-term close reading project of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. We've now reached the halfway point of the novel, so this week we've read the first section of the sixth chapter, and this section has the title Changes. So what happened in this section? Carnival is over, and not only Claudia Chauchat, but also Joachim's secret love, Marussia, with the orange perfume, has left. Spring comes in stages, first deceptively, then has to give way to winter again, and until it finally manages to return. And with the arrival of spring, also restlessness increases among the patients. So there is this fear of missing out on life, and this fear spreads, and it leads to rash departures. Although everyone involved knows that in most cases this freedom will only be a brief interlude, they will soon have to return to the Berghof because life in the flatland will not do them any good. Hans has got an X-ray picture of Claudia as a sort of souvenir when she left, and now he admires this X-ray picture in a schoolboy manner, just like he did with the pencil shavings from Přibyslav Hippe back from Přibyslav Hippe's pencil back then at school. Dr. Blumenkohl has died, and Mr. Ferge, the Russian traveling salesman, is doing much better. And the Berkov's humanist in residence, Lodovico Settembrini, he moves to the village as he can no longer be helped at the Berkov. And Hans secretly visits the psychoanalyst Dr. Krokowski to lick the wounds of his lovesick soul. So a whole series of changes and 3 to 4 months condensed into 30 pages. So we can already see an acceleration in the pace of the narration. And all these changes are not really presented to us as an action, but rather described in the casual conversational tone as something that just happens with a sort of an clockwork-like inevitability. uh, or as one man would put it, time brings about these changes. And that brings me to the very important keyword, time. But first things first, as usual, I've tried to structure my observations and thoughts for this video into a few chapters, which you can all access individually by using the timestamps. So chapter number 1 is the nature of time. The second chapter is deception and unreason. Number 3, nature is indifferent. And number 4, once again, love and death. Okay, let's start with the beginning, with the first topic, the nature of time. The reader is not given an easy start to the second half of the novel. At a first glance, the first page of the sixth chapter is a somewhat dry theoretical reflection on time, similar to the so-called preface or prologue on the very first pages of the novel, which is also a theoretical consideration whose meaning only really becomes clear and apparent on the second or third reading. And there too, the subject was time, among other things. And meanwhile, we as readers are a little bit more familiar with this topic too, and the narrator takes it up here again. But now the topic is also expanded. It's not just about time, but about 3 quantities or phenomena. It's about time, space, and motion, whereby the latter, the motion, refers to the first 2, time and space, or it can only be defined by using the first 2. Movement is a change in the position of an object in space over time. So at least that's the definition in the classical physical sense. So time and space are the immovable givens or the reference values, and movement can be expressed with reference to these two, to time and space. So mathematically speaking, movement is a function of time and space. And Thomas Mann is also using this sort of expression. Uh, Time is a function of space or vice versa. And um, Einstein's theory of relativity has thoroughly shaken up this concept of time and space as the immovable absolute entities. Einstein showed that the causalities between these phenomena can be understood quite differently, and that not only they can be understood, they need to be understood quite differently, at least for the explanation of some observations in the field of physics. It's inevitable to look at these quantities, time and space, from a completely different perspective. Only from a lay popular scientific examination of the statements of Einstein's theory of relativity, the rhetorical questions in this first page of chapter 6 can be understood. So, would there be no time if there were no movement? Or would there be no movement if there's no time? Is time a function of space or the other way around? All this was triggered by the observations from Einstein and his relativity theory. Um, it has become a truism that subjectively perceived time is relative, and that the elapsed time span varies from event to event and from individual to individual. But above all this, there was still, prior to Einstein, there was still the certainty that physically measurable time is an objective absolute quantity, something that is fundamentally the same for everybody, everywhere, anytime. And the same applied to space. Although the distance between objects can change due to movement, the surrounding space itself does not. So ultimately, our entire worldview, our everyday's worldview is based on this. That's the foundation that we regard as secure and immovable, because otherwise our entire logic, our understanding of before and after, of large and small, of forward and backward, of sideways and up and down, of causality, of cause and effect, all this is thrown off kilter, and we are faced with a bunch of irreconcilable paradoxes if we do not take these quantities, time and space, as immovable or constant and absolute. And moving one step further, if we think about things that are infinite, that also causes a lot of trouble for us. If we embed all that time and space into an infinite and eternal universe, what sense does it make to talk about changes in space and time? Does every object and every duration shrink together into an infinitely small point on an infinitely large scale? So this thought experiment by Thomas Mann that he's doing here is most easily imagined by using the example of a geographical map. So if the scale of the map becomes infinite large, then any arbitrarily large object is only an extensionless tiny point corresponding to the dimensionless mathematical definition of point. So these are, in somewhat more complicated senses, the thoughts, the speculations, and above all, the questions that the narrator expounds on the first page. But where do these thoughts come from? And what does Einstein's theory of relativity have to do with it? And what does Einstein's theory actually mean? And the questions the narrator is asking here, are they even meaningful, and are they permissible questions, or is there a misunderstanding about the scientific concept of the theory of relativity behind all these statements and questions and speculation? I will try to elucidate the matter a little bit by trying to explain Einstein's theory of relativity as simply as possible. And in doing so, I do not distinguish between the two theories of relativity that Einstein developed, the so-called special theory of relativity from 1905, and later the so-called general theory of relativity 1915. As already mentioned, until Einstein came along, physics had always tacitly assumed that there was the same absolute space and the same absolute time scale for all objects and for all human or hypothetical observers. And this also corresponds well to our everyday experience. For each of us, the clocks run at the same speed, so if they're not broken, and 1 meter is the same length all over the world. almost everything we do is every day is based on this basic assumption, and also most of our technical advices are based on this. But Einstein has now been able to show that we can only explain certain physical phenomena, especially in the microcosm at the atomic or subatomic level, or even more so in the macrocosm in space, if we take a different look at things, if we turn these basic assumptions upside down. And this is relevant for two specific conditions. Number one, when objects move at extremely high speeds, the speeds that can be expressed as significant fractions of the speed of light, then time no longer can be considered as something that passes uniformly and with an absolute constant speed. If an observer remains stationary and an object moves at such a high speed, passing the observer, then for the observer, time on this moving object moves more slowly in this object from his point of view. And the technical term for this is called time dilation. A popular example to illustrate this is the so-called twin paradox. If we have an identical pair of twins and one of them goes on a trip into space as an astronaut at an extremely high speed, um, and then returns to Earth, they are no longer the same age at the end, but for the astronaut, the time has passed more slowly, or rather less time has passed for him or her. So he or she is younger than the twin who stayed on Earth. So traveling keeps you young. So this is physical approval. So and this is now very roughly abbreviated and simplified, but I think it's more than sufficient for this type of literature video. So what ultimately follows from this, by the way, is that time and space are not absolute constant quantities anymore, but the only thing, the new thing in the universe that is truly absolute and constant, so to speak, that's the speed of light. That is the new absolute reference point. Um, but to wrap up this first aspect of Einstein's theory of relativity in a casual short sentence, extremely high speeds change time. The second point is that also extremely large masses, they also change something, namely they change space. Space bends or curves near masses, and near in particular close to large masses. So actually this is not quite correct in physics. Physicists tend to speak of what is known as space-time. So as if a time were added as a fourth dimension to the three dimensions of space. And this space-time, this is curved by large masses. And this can also be observed, for example, in black holes. So these are gigantic masses in the universe that have, due to their mass, they have such a strong gravitational force that even light cannot escape from them, hence black holes. And around in black holes and also uh, at their immediate interface of space-time is extremely strongly curved, and there some effects occur that seem paradoxical to our everyday logic. So to sum up these in two sentences, Einstein's theory of relativity say in a nutshell that space and time are not absolute and not the same for everyone everywhere. High speeds and large masses can change space and time. Okay, that was a little bit exhausting, but for us, but also for the people at the time, and it also fueled a lot of speculation, the speculative imagination, especially of the non-physicists, of the philosophers and other very imaginative fellow citizens. So if space and time are so variable, and then of course you can ask all these speculative questions. So what about the measurability of space and time? What do big and small and slow and fast and before and after uh, um, what does this all mean? Does it mean anything at all? And if there still such a thing as a binding temporal sequence of events, and what does it mean to say that things happen the same time if time is not the same for everybody? And what about causality in that case? And Accordingly, in the slipstream of the theory of relativity in Thomas Mann's time, there were a whole host of popular science and speculative books that ask precisely these questions. And uh, this also inspired even more the lay discourse on these issues. And Thomas Mann also dealt with those works. He, of all people who intended to write a novel about time with this magic mountain, he found these questions highly interesting, fascinating. So Thomas Mann certainly did not understand the theory of relativity in depth. So he was simply lacking the scientific, physical education and training, the necessary background training. But he did study the popular science literature on it, and he reflected on the questions and the speculations discussed in these books, and he picked it up for his novel. And so this is why he presents these ideas and speculations and questions also to us readers as questions or train of thought without being able to answer them. For those who are a little more interested in how this could be judged or valued or classified, here's a brief didactic digression on the theory of science. Others can jump on to the next chapter. All this speculation about whether the theory of relativity, the fact that space and time are no longer considered absolute, whether this has any significance for our normal lives, I think this is mainly based on a small but crucial misunderstanding of scientific theories and scientific models. I already mentioned in something about the philosophy of science in my 12th video. I mentioned that natural science does not describe the world as it is, but in the way how we can understand it and express it in logical formulas. And for this, we often use models as a sort of makeshift construct of thought. You may remember. So, for example, I mentioned this example that you can imagine an atom as a kind of solar system with something in the core and something moving quickly around. That doesn't mean that the atom actually looks like that. And by the way, that model is already highly outdated. Whatever. What I didn't explain in detail in that video at the time was the following. Is the following: every scientific theory, every scientific model has a specific field of application. It applies to a very specific area, for example, to a certain size scale. And it's a job of the scientists to define this exactly and to make sure that they apply these models only for within the boundaries of these conditions. Because only within this range, this model or theory is valid and can provide meaningful results and also can lead to meaningful questions. If you have a model and you that works in one context and or theory and you transfer it to a much larger or a much smaller scale, for example, in science we call that extrapolating. It might work, but usually it leads to just false results. Um, or it may make things unnecessarily complicated, or it may be that the model is too simplified for the new conditions. So you might have to use simpler models or even more sophisticated ones for the new under the new conditions. I will try to explain this with a very simple example. Most people will know this simple experiment from school, from science or physics class, which shows that water rises equally high in connected tubes. So nothing to do with relativity, just as an example for the application range of scientific models. So water rises to the same level in connected tubes, no matter what shape they are. So anybody can try it at home. A simple model or a simple law of nature that is always true. Always? Really? Let's make a little thought experiment. What happens if we keep the tubes as they are, but we make the connection, we separate them further apart. We make the connection between these tubes several thousand kilometers long. One tube is in Germany, in Hamburg, and the second one is in the US, in New York. So then, of course, this simple model is no longer true. We suddenly have tidal effects. It is low tide at one end of the world and high tide at the other. So the water is no longer the same height. So the difference in height in between the two water columns is no longer zero, and we need a quite sophisticated mathematical model to calculate the difference uh, accurately. Or just the other way around, we can leave the connection between the tubes as it is, just a few centimeters apart. But then uh, let's make one tube extremely narrow, just a millimeter in diameter or even less. So then we suddenly we don't have to deal with tidal effects, but we have the capillary effect. So in the very thin tube, the interaction between water and the glass surface suddenly becomes much more important than gravity, and the water rises higher here. So the thinner the tube, the higher the water rises. Again, our simple model is not true anymore, and we need a more sophisticated one that even includes nasty mathematical formula with Greek symbols in it, etc. So for very large or very small systems, we suddenly need a different scientific model to explain the phenomena. But vice versa, using these complicated ones for the simple setting in the medium range wouldn't make any sense. In the normal everyday model, if we look at the sewage system at our house and if it is clogged, so water comes up from the toilet, from the sink again, so we don't need a model that looks at tidal effects or capillary effects. And any plumber who starts rambling about these effects should be thrown out of the house as quickly as possible. We need a plumber who understands the normal everyday model of connected tubes and who's able to fix the problem. And it's just the same with the models, with scientific models, and with also the theory of relativity. We need it when we have to deal with extremely high velocities, high speed, or extremely large masses. But for our normal, everyday life and the objects in our vicinity, all these effects of curved space or time dilation, they don't make any sense. They're irrelevant and even misleading. And so Thomas Mann's speculations here about time, they are a nice intellectual mind game. And of course, they add a certain philosophical spice to the novel. So, but for our normal everyday life, they do not have to influence our belief in things like movement, causality, and the physical course of time. And working under the assumption that the time is something and space are something like absolute quantities, so the same for everybody on Earth. It's a safe hypothesis to live with. So, okay, is anyone still watching? Then we can move on with the actual novel. After Thomas Mann has prepared us on a theoretical level for the idea that our conception of time and also of temporal sequence might be deceptive, he then, as if to illustrate this, also places a few anachronistic things into this section. Uh, I noticed two things. On the one hand, he takes up ideas also from the general theory of relativity, which was not published until 1915. So it was therefore not known at the time of the action of the novel takes place in 1908. And there's also an allusion to the sinking of the Titanic when Settembrini mentions a ship rushing vertically into the abyss or into the depths. So to me, this is a clear reference. The conversation must have taken place at mid-April. If we look at all the hints about the date in the novel, because Easter Sunday was at 1908 was the 19th of April, and this talk must have been a few days earlier. So, and it's a fairly clear allusion to the Titanic because also it sank in the night between April 14th and April 15th, but 4 years later, 1912 and not 1908. So here we see a similar trick to the one used in the description of the visit to the cinema, the movie that Hans and Joachim and Karen watched there. That the movie that the narrator describes, he describes a film that was not possible in 1908, and it describes a very specific film that came into the cinemas in the early 1920s. Last observation on this topic, the narrator also explicitly addresses the difference between narrative time and narrated time in this section. And this is also sort of a postmodern approach. He addresses the reader and describes that there's a difference or there is some sort of parallelity between the time that has passed on the Magic Mountain and also the time that has passed for the narration of the events. So that's it for this first chapter, the nature of time. Let's move on to the second chapter, deception and unreason, or irrationality. With this first page of speculative questions about the reliability of our perception of space, time, movement, and change, the narrator has now prepared the ground to show us, specifically with regard to the characters, that many phenomena are deceptive, that also nature deceives us about the passage of time. The seasons, for example, are deceptive. First, spring arrives or seems to arrive. So the ladies attempted to wear light clothing, but it was only deception. Winter is far from over and suddenly breaks in again with force. And there's nothing we can do about it. People have become the plaything of time or the seasons. But also the actual end of winter is again deceptive. So what at first glance looks like little specks of ice and snow in the meadows are in fact spring flowers, crocuses, the first signs of spring. So nothing is as it seems. Nothing can be planned or predicted. In the secluded world of the mountains, unpredictable nature sets the pace. Time brings change, but we are at its mercy. And even the tools that humans create to understand nature and make it controllable, also these tools are imperfect and deceptive. And good example here is this so-called Gaffkey scale. It's a helpless attempt to make uh, measurable the extent of the disease, make it quantifiable. It was a smart approach, but in the end, it is just as fickle as spring. The Gaffkey value cannot be relied upon. Maybe it's a good snapshot of the patient's situation, but it's not very reasonable to build any prediction on it. So Joachim also had to learn this the hard way. A Gaffkey value means nothing. And when the doctor's verdict in the end is lifelong for some patients, then that too is an illusion, is a deception, because what it really means is life will be short. You will die here on this mountain, and most likely very soon. So life imprisonment on the Berghof can be a very short period of time. So once again, it's a variation on the theme of time is relative. And in this climate of deception and uncertainty, it's no wonder that people make unreasonable and irrational decisions. So also all these hasty departures of some patients who are hungry for life, these are very vivid example of this irrationality. We see also unreason and deception in dealing with death. Dr. Blumenkohl has died, but this is not talked about. People deceive themselves by ignoring this death as much as possible, not talking about it, and even changing the seating arrangement at the table so that this gap where Dr. Blumenkohl used to sit, that this does not constantly remind them of the dead. So, and there can be no question of Hans and Joachim taking care of the dying patients either. So these visits no longer seem to take place. So also here, self-deception prevails. Hans now, he has his head full of his love sickness, and all that remains for him is well, Claudia is also has departed, and all that remains for him is this X-ray picture, and that too is only a deception and unreason. It doesn't show Claudia at all. It shows her skeleton and internal organs, and he, not being a physician, he cannot actually interpret this and this image. So nevertheless, he kisses it as if it were a real person. I think, incidentally, this is a nice parallel to Hans' earlier schoolboy-like behavior, just as he kept the shavings from Přibislav Hippe's pencil at school. He kept it for years. Now he keeps Clavia's X-ray image with the similarly cute gesture, like a schoolboy does, keeping it like as a relic and kissing it as if it were an icon. So but she is probably as indifferent to him as surrounding nature is. Otherwise, she would not have left immediately after this night of love spent together. So, for me, also the conversation between Hans and Behrens also fits into this thematic complex of Claudia and deception. For me, it's like a dance of two masters of deception, but with a nice contrasting element. Hans is very verbose. He really opens up and rambles wildly. He wants to create the appearance of mentioning Claudia just as an inconsequential topic, quite by accident in front of parents. But his manipulative intention becomes very clear with every sentence he says. He not only wants to deceive Behrens, but he also wants to elicit some information from Behrens about Claudia and about their relation. Behrens, on the other hand, is very taciturn. He also wants to deceive Hans by showing a great indifference to Claudia. But I think the fact that he stings Hans at a particularly painful point is a little bit revealing. And he also contradicts himself. On the one hand, he says that she definitely isn't writing to him, has never done so, but then he suddenly knows that she has difficulties with the German spelling. So he can only know this if he has read something she has written. So two deceived deceivers who try to deceive each other. And deception is also what Joachim sees in Hans' behavior, because Hans suddenly secretly sneaks into Dr. Krokowski's office to have his lovesick soul dissected or cured. Let's move on to the third chapter of my observations, the indifference of nature. Nature is quite indifferent, again, about our human fate. I find it I find it striking that nature is not described as an idyllic element here, but it's described in all its harshness and hostility or indifference. So one aspect is its fickleness and unpredictability. So nature is also described as something that is unpredictable. It can also be something that can bring death. So this specific warm, dry weather in the Alps, it can supposedly increase the risk of hemorrhage or hemoptysis. And the colors in which nature is described here, these are mostly colors associated with coldness. There's a lot of talk about white, sometimes also about white and blue, and I think it's easy to imagine this sort of snow-covered landscape with a blue, frosty sky, not a warm sky, a beautiful but cold nature that is hostile to humans and life. And in this context, I also it struck me that also Claudia's clothing when she leaves, it described as white and blue, exactly the same colors as those used for the winter landscape in this chapter. In my opinion, this is not not a coincidence, but it's done on purpose by the narrator to draw some parallel between, because I think Claudia's character is just as indifferent and vacillating towards Hans as nature is towards us humans. Okay, let's move on to the fourth um, and final chapter of today's video. Again, love and death. Um, the connection between love and death and Eros and Thanatos in this section is also striking. This is not new either, but it's strongly emphasized in this section. We can see this clearly in this reported shift in the focus of Dr. Krokowski's lectures, which now no longer deal with love and illness, but with love and death. We also kind of see this in this mentioned fungus, this so-called moral. It's a phallic symbol, and it's an aphrodisiac, but it's a plant that secretes mucus and it smells of decomposition, of putrefaction. That is, it smells of death. And an interesting point is the mention of the Italian writer and philosopher Brunetto Latini, which also presents a hidden link between Eros and death. Brunetto Latini was a little bit older than Dante Alighieri, and he most likely was a teacher of Dante. And Latini was also a writer. As mentioned in the text, he wrote books of both a more encyclopedic and didactic nature. He compiled the knowledge of his time in a form also understandable to non-experts, in particular to non-clerics. And he wrote a kind of a moralizing poem about virtue and vice. And this is what is mentioned in the text. And an interesting thing is that we know about Latini um, because Dante mentions Latini in his Divine Comedy. But interestingly enough, Dante puts Latini, his cherished teacher, in the second circle of hell among the sodomites. And this is a term that at that time was primarily used for homosexuality. And so um, this at this point in his uh, reminiscence, in remembering, thinking about Brunetto Latini, Hans blushes. And it is explicitly described that he blushes as he did months earlier when Settembrini came into his bedroom, turned on the light, and thus startled Hans out of his daydreaming, probably erotic daydreams. And the fact that Hans blushes at the memory of Latini among the sodomites and blushes exactly in that same way as he did when Settembrini entered the chamber. I think this can be interpreted as a sort of a bashful awareness of the homoerotic component of his own sexuality. He, for some parts of this section, he seems to be in a kind of an inner, this imagined dispute with Settembrini, and then he dismisses all this with a strange exclamation, and I'm quoting the German original, "Razzi mausi falli." The English translation I'm reading translate this rather strangely into "umani spaghetti," which doesn't make any sense here to me, and it makes you miss some important allusions made into the statement in its original German version. The German razzi mausi falli is a word play with the word for rat trap and mouse trap, but the German word for trap falle is misspelled or misquoted here like falli, and this is also, it's slightly modified in a way that makes it sound like the word phallus. And so this, and the reference to rat is interesting because in an early video I've already pointed out this depiction of Settembrini as a Pied Piper early on, and yeah, it can be read as an allusion to the word rat trap, a deadly tool that has also appeared in the novel once before, as you may remember, in the second chapter, when this regular conversation between Hans and his grandfather is described. Among the objects that are stored in this glass cabinet, where the family's baptismal bowl is kept, many precious objects, but then suddenly a rat trap is mentioned. A brief reference to death is lurking everywhere. And this comes up here again, and a rat trap and the fellows, and the word falli naturally evokes this association with the fellows, and that again establishes this connection between death and eroticism. Death or the underworld, also Hades, also appears in Settembrini's malicious allusion to Hans' night of love spent with Claudia. Settembrini compares it to eating a pomegranate, and this is an allusion to the ancient Greek legend of Persephone. For the sake of brevity, I will quote Wikipedia here. The underworld god Hades abducted Persephone to the underworld to make her his wife. But the father of gods, Zeus, decided that the girl could return to her mother, Demeter, if she had not eaten anything in the underworld. But shortly before her return, um, Hades pushed some pomegranate seeds into Persephone's mouth, and she ate 4 of the 12 pomegranate seeds. So, since she had eaten something in the underworld, after all, she had to rule with Hades in the underworld for 4 months of the year and spend the other 2/3 of the year with her mother Demeter in the realm of the living. So this is how Greek mythology explains the origin of the seasons. So Persephone is the goddess of fertility in general, while her mother Demeter is responsible for the fertility of the earth, for agriculture, for sowing and grain. So during the part of the year when her daughter Persephone has to be in the underworld, the mother is mourning, and it's winter on earth, nothing grows, nature comes to a standstill. So when Settembrini accuses Hans of having eaten pomegranate seeds, what he actually is trying to say is, now you are in the clutches of the Berghof, of this modern Hades, a separate realm of the dead. You will have to stay here, or at least you will have to keep returning because you have become attached to Claudia. The mention of Persephone, the Persephone myth also makes sense at this time of the year, at the beginning of spring, because Persephone was abducted into Hades when she picked daffodils in spring. And it's also that time of spring when the daffodils begin to bloom here, when Persephone returns to Earth. It's that time of the year now in the novel. So, and it's no coincidence that the Christian festival of the holiday of Easter, this celebration of a resurrection from the dead, that this also takes place around this time. Actually, in German, daffodils are called Osterglocken, which means literally translated Easter bells. So making clear the connection between these flowers and Easter time, and the holiday of this for celebrating a resurrection. And it's certainly no coincidence that also Settembrini drops the bombshell news about his moving out, that he drops this on Easter Sunday. So he will leave the Berghof because Behrens has given him his life sentence, and life sentence here actually means you will die. You will soon die up here in the mountains. But he mentioned this on Easter Sunday, on this Christian feast about resurrection from the dead. So again, a beautiful play with mythology, with religion, with symbolism, and with contrast between death and life. And I think it's also, talking about contrast, it's also a nice and particularly humorous move of the narrator to place Settembrini, the man who is skeptical of all physical pleasures, of all the pleasures by use of our senses, and a man who seems to have only a single pair of trousers. He places him in the house of a spice merchant, and also as a subtenant of a lady's tailor. The English translation I'm using does not call the house owner a spice merchant, but a petty chandler. I don't fully agree with the translator's choice here, but anyway, um, that's it for today. Let's keep it like this. Um, so I hope you have enjoyed my ramblings about my observations and my thoughts that were triggered by my reading of this first section of the 6th chapter. If this is the case, please let me know in the comments, or if you've made any additional observations, feel free to share your ideas in the comments. I will be very happy to read it. The next video will be online in about a week, and it will be about the second section of chapter 6. And yeah, I'll hope to see you next time. Until then, have a great reading time. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.